is a witch! She is the one! I did not do it! She killed him! Avenge him!
Please, calm down.
He begged not to die alone. And I held him as his breath faded.
We need order! We need order.
He stopped breathing under Aeneas' hands and Elise shouted, "You killed him," before anyone could close the door. Suspicion arrived with her voice, sharp and loud in the small cottage, and it settled over the widower's shoulders as if a rough shawl had been thrown there. Mary stood at the bedside, palms flat against the mattress, and the body of her husband lay with his coat half open, one ear reddened from the evening slamp. The central problem was plain within those first seconds. A private farewell risked becoming a public inquiry, and Mary had to hold the line between grief and accusation. Enya pressed her fingers to the old man's neck and let out the single quiet that midwives keep for the end of a life. "He's gone, Enya." And her voice was steady enough to name the fact. "Elise, go find Thomas and tell him to come quietly." Mary, though her mouth felt thick. Elise answered with a hard laugh, "Tell Thomas. Tell the constable. You've been hiding debts under your man's coat all month." Mary moved to cover the dead man's hands with a folded linen. Her hands trembled, but she did not look away. The suspicion threaded every exchange and drove Mary's speaking, her decisions, each small motion. Within moments the village became an active presence. The neighbor's accusation drew other voices at the threshold. Someone hammered the back door. Jonna stood by the hearth, sleeves dusted with flour from the bakery, and he did not speak until Thomas arrived with his lantern, and two other men behind him. "What happened?" "Thomas and Mary," he breathed his last here. "We kept watch." "Enya can say so." Thomas' face tightened. "We must notify the magistrate if there's doubt," he replied. The argument was immediate. The disagreement over whether to summon authorities or allow a vigil put the family under strain that had nothing to do with the dead man's breathing. Enya scrubbed her hands at the basin while Sam, the boy, sat with his knees drawn up and watched where the body's coat lay open. "Sam, come here, Mary." And Sam climbed down, fingernails dirty, eyes not meeting hers. "Do not touch the coat," Enya warned. Her voice carried the authority of work seen and practiced. Mary folded the wife's scarf tighter under her chin and moved slowly, each step deliberate. The suspicion in the cottage made people's reactions small and clipped. Mary felt it tighten her throat and guide her choices. She hushed Sam, she kept the body covered, she barred the door with an arm when Elise moved closer. About 20 minutes after the first accusation, Thomas spoke in a voice meant to moderate and to insist on procedure. "We cannot pretend we do not have a duty," he said. "If there is a scrap suggesting debt or meeting, we must examine it." Mary looked at him and then at Jonna. "Thomas, please. Let us hold a private vigil." He was not violent. He helped Jonah Hasboy last winter when he had the fever. Jonah stepped forward. "Mary's right. He helped my boy. Let them speak now and we'll speak later." Thomas' jaw clenched, but he paused. The decision hung, a private right or a public summons. The household set to work. Enya directed the washing and the shrouding with precise motions. "Bring the warm water," she said. "Fold the linen just so." Mary and Enya stripped the coat away and washed the man's neck and hands, the motion an exercise of contact and habit. Sam handed cloths and resisted when a neighbor's glance lingered on the open pocket. "Done, look in it." "Sam, Mary." He looked anyway and then turned away, rubbing his thumb. The practical tasks kept panic at bay. They also exposed quiet ruptures. Elise lingered too long at the doorway, her mouth pressed as if she had been forced to swallow remarks she wanted to spit out. Thomas watched her, and his attention carried more than procedure. It carried civic weight. While folding the shroud, Enya's fingers found a folded scrap of paper tucked into a hidden seam of the coat. She held it up without speaking at first. The paper's edges looked damp and its handwriting was small and hurried. Aeneas' eyebrows rose. "There is something here," she said. Mary reached for it and then stopped. "Give it to me," Thomas ordered, stepping in. Elise's face went blank and then hard. "I told you, Mary." Elise, he owed coin to the miller. He met someone near the bridge 2 nights ago. You all knew that. Conversation snapped into shorter sentences, more accusations. The scrap transformed suspicion into a possible motive in the ears of those present. Word of the scrap did not stay in the cottage. A messenger ran to the square, and voices multiplied there, each retelling adding a sharper edge. In the square, men and women gathered around the lanterns and the well, faces carved by the cold and curiosity. They found a note. One said, "A debt." "A meeting by the bridge," another answered. The village divided into threads of opinion, some inclined toward sorrow, others toward blame. Elise stood near the well and repeated what she'd heard in a tone that refused kindness. "He was to meet a creditor," she said. "Maybe they had words." Jonah tried to speak for calm. "Look, Jonah, you knew him. Tell them he'll not harm them now." Merry when Jonah appeared at the cottage doorway with a lantern. Jonah did not shout over the crowd. He stepped onto a bench and called their attention in measured words. "Listen to Jonah, Thomas." But suspicion had already reached more ears than Jonah could quiet. Outside, someone began to call for the magistrate. Inside, Mary folded the sheet once more and placed a palm over the scrap before Thomas could read it aloud in front of all. "He is a man, Thomas," she said. Voice low, he had trouble. "Let us keep him as he was to us. Let us pray and then, if you must, do your duty." Thomas' hands tightened around his lantern. "Duty is about the living," he answered. "It is also about the dead." The exchange pulled at neighbors' loyalties. Some shifted closer to Mary. Others took the elder's side. The household chose whose company to keep, and that choice would steer them into the morning. At the square, a new voice rose. Jonah's friend Lee, who had been on the receiving end of kindness from the dead man months back, stepped forward and spoke with a quick clarity. "He fed my boy when the soup ran out," she said. "He gave me the rope to mend my roof." Her words were not loud, but they traveled. "Jonah, tell them." Jonah repeated the small acts he had seen. He paid for medicine. He never struck a woman in this village. Let them hold their inquiries later. The crowd shifted. Faces softened and hardened in turn. Mary listened from the doorway and felt the public mood sway like linen lowered into water. The next external event was a messenger arriving with the magistrate's seal. The paper from the coat had been shown to the clerk in the morning market. Someone claimed to have seen the man in a heated talk the night before. Thomas read the clerk's account aloud. A meeting at the bridge, a name of a creditor, details that sounded like motive. The villagers murmured. Jonah came forward and asked to speak to Thomas in private. "Let Jonah speak," Mary pleaded. In their brief exchange, Jonah, "Thomas, if you call the magistrate now, you will drag this family into a long shame. Let them burn the note and have a proper farewell." Thomas hesitated. He was a man of rules. He also had a ledger and a lineage to protect. This hesitation was the pivot of choice in that room. Mary made a choice that night. She took the scrap and, with a trembling hand, placed it on the iron tray used for warming tea and set a small coin on top, as if the coin alone could hold the paper. With a single tilt of her hand, she set the match and watched the edges blacken. "Mary, no Enia." But Mary covered the match with her fingers for a moment, and then let the flame catch. The paper curled and turned to ash. Voices rose in short lines.
"Mary!"
Thomas shouted, "Do you destroy evidence? Jonah, let it go. Let them have their prayers." The burning changed the direction of everyone's anger and of the village's memory in a handful of breaths. At dawn they moved toward the river bank. The crowd accompanied them in a slow line, lanterns bobbing. The elder insisted on standing with a small group representing the household and the magistrate's responsibilities. Mary walked between Jonah and Enia. Sam limped along with a bundle of flowers he had picked. The river smelled of silt and cold. Mary held the cloth, wrapped body. She had stitches of decision soon through that night. The privacy of the vigil, the burning of the scrap, the acceptance of Jonah's support. She felt each choice as weight under her shawl. The confrontation at the riverside became sharp. Thomas stepped forward and said, "We must know why he met a creditor at night. You have destroyed a paper that may hold the truth." Mary looked at him and then at the crowd. "Thomas," she said, "you will not make my husband's death a public punishment. You can ask questions later. Leave now with your record. Let us finish this." Thomas answered with 3 clipped lines meant to unseat her. "This is not only about you. This concerns the safety of the village. This concerns contagion of debt and bribery." The crowd swayed. Someone spat into the water. Elise called his name from the bank. The tension rose until the exchange became the most intense moment of the chapter. The mid-chapter twist arrived then. A woman in the back recognized the handwriting on the scraps as that of the miller's apprentice, whom few suspected and who had been seen arguing with the dead man over a shorn ledger. "It is not Mary or her husband who wrote that," she said. "The script matches the ledger at the mill house." A hush followed. Elise's face paled as if the cold found new roads. Thomas' authority caught in his throat. Jonah stepped forward and said, "If that's true, then the scrap is not motive against Mary. It is a sign of someone else using his coat to frame him." The new information changed how the villagers understood earlier moments, and Mary felt a sudden hot relief replace fear with a cautious clarity. Still, there was danger left. The miller refused to come forward at once. Elise accused the miller in short, sharp phrases across the river. "He would profit from the man's fall," she said. "He has the ledger and the coin." Jonah shouted back, "Elise, do you stand with rumor or with proof?" The crowd split again, but the accusation of the miller introduced a different direction for judgment. The scene forced Thomas to choose whether to pursue the miller or to accept Mary's right and let the community mourn. Mary made another concrete choice. She knelt by the river and unwrapped the body with hands that did not shake now so much as move with purpose. She set the man's right hand on the water's edge and whispered a prayer in a voice that described his name and a detail. How he had taught Sam to tie knots on a fishing line. The act named him again as he had been to people. Neighbor, debtor, helper. Then Mary stood and turned to the crowd. "Let the miller be asked in the morning," she said. "For now, we lay him to rest as our man." The decision held enough firmness to slow the crowd's momentum. The rite at the river was modest. Jonah placed Sam's flowers on the cloth. Enya sang a short litany of brief lines, not long verses, just the practical requests for warmth and care for what fades. The villagers watched, some with heads bowed, others with hands clenched. In the midst of the ceremony, a dog barked from the bank, and someone in the back laughed once. An involuntary sound that punctured the gravity and reminded everyone of simple life continuing. The river took the small wreaths and carried their ribbons along with leaves and ash from the burned scrap. After the rite, the crowd dispersed in small groups. Thomas walked beside Jonah for a while and spoke in low tones. "You did well, Jonah." "Thomas," and Jonah answered, "We did what we could, Thomas." "Don't make this worse than it is." The exchange was short, but it shifted responsibility back towards civil procedure without immediate force. Elise left without saying goodbye. Sam walked the last steps beside Mary and said, "Will he be cold?" Mary knelt and pressed the back of her hand to his cheek. "He will sleep," she said. Back at the cottage, the hearth still had embers, but the air carried less speech. Enya stoked the fire with small twigs and folded the linen where the body had been prepared. A single wilted wreath leaned on the chair beside the hearth. Jonah helped Mary sit and offered her a cup of watered ale. She accepted and took 2 slow sips. The immediate heat of accusation had retreated into a haze of tired bodies and quiet departures. Mary felt the last of the night's choices settle. Burning the scrap, insisting on the private right, and accepting Jonas' word against a public trial until evidence demanded otherwise. Outside, the miller's son had been brought by a neighbor to speak with Thomas the next morning. That development promised new questions, another turn that could lead to formal inquiry. But the household's choice to protect a small, dignified farewell had altered what the mourning would look like. Small hands on linen, a list of favors owed to the dead, a debt that might yet be proven. Mary sat by the hearth and pressed her forehead to her knees. She opened her eyes when Enya placed the cup down and said, "You did as much as any woman could do under a shouting roof." Mary nodded and then reached for the wilted wreath. She straightened it with practiced fingers and set it on the chair. The chapter closed on a modest beat of domestic detail that preserved the night's human choices. Jonah and Enya gathered up the leftover clothes. Sam tucked his muddy shoes beneath the table. Mary stood and, with a small and deliberate motion, carried the wreath to the window-sill where lamplight caught the faded ribbon. She paused, listened for steps on the lane. A soft knock sounded at the outer door. That knock, real, deliberate, ended the chapter with a concrete movement that linked what had been decided to what must still be faced in daylight. Emotion root. Suspicion, emotion shifts, suspicion fear resolve, suspicion anger cautious relief. These emotional movements drove Mary's choices across the vigil, the preparation, the burning of the scrap, the riverside confrontation, and the modest farewell that followed. Elise hauled the shrouded body into the square and shouted, "Enya killed him!" The word landed like a stone. Suspicion tightened the ring of faces faster than the morning light could reach the lamp. Enya stood by the cottage doorway, one hand pressed to her apron, the other still smelling of starch and sweat from the night's vigil. The crowd leaned in. Voices rose in single words. Murder, neglect, lock her up. Enya's first movement was physical. She stepped forward and set both palms flat against the coffin lid. Feeling the rough linen and cold stiffness, where she had straightened a jaw an hour earlier. She had been awake through the night. She had held his shoulder, counted breaths, and smoothed the fold of blanket when the fever shook him. She had felt, in the room's hush, the moment he went quiet under her hands. Mary had seen that. Elise had seen the shouting. The village had now seen the body. The problem was clear to all. A man dead, a widow suspected, and neighbors demanding a cause. Voices fractured into arguments. Bring the parson, someone said. Bring the midwife, another called. A child pushed between ankles and tugged at a woman's skirts. The parson, a lean man with a furrowed forehead, pushed through and put his palm on the coffin's end. "Stop," he said. "Let the midwife speak first." The parson's voice cut the immediate heat, but not the accusation. Elise jabbed a finger. She killed him. She said. She sat there and watched him cold. Mary stepped between Elise and Enya. "Elise, not here. Mary." Her voice was low but urgent. She looked at Enya for permission, and then at the crowd for order. Enya only breathed and let her jaw work. Her disbelief had turned to a narrow, focused fear. Suspicion aimed at her would not only take her dignity, but threaten the small pile of household favors that kept them fed. The midwife arrived, wiping her hands on her apron, eyes sharp and practical. She set down a satchel and opened it, in the square where everyone could see. "I will examine him," she said. "We will know if this was sudden violence, or if illness took him." Elise spat on the cobbles. "You will find what I say," she answered. "You will see how she left him to die." The crowd pushed closer. A man knocked over a lantern stand and murmured as the flame guttered. The parson spoke to the crowd in short sentences to fill a pause. "We will not judge before the midwife looks. Come back to the church lamp after the examination." People muttered but parted to let the midwife and Mary toward the cottage. Enya's knees trembled. She opened her mouth and said, "I wrapped him warm. I tied the blanket 3 times." Her voice came out thin. Mary touched the back of her wrist and squeezed. Inside the cottage, the midwife moved with plain gestures. She lifted the corner of the sheet and felt along the man's neck and chest. She unbuttoned a shirt with 2 fingers and held the cloth up to the light. "There is a dressing here," she said, pointing fresh. "Someone tried to stanch fever boils. He has signs of prolonged fever, coughing for days. He kept off warm bedding, I think." He shivered alone. Mary swallowed and produced a small, muddied handkerchief from a chest, the corner dark with old sweat. "This was under him," she said. "I found it by the threshold." The midwife's face changed only in scale. She did not gasp. "We must tell the square what we find." They carried the small items out. Out in the square, the sight of the handkerchief and the crude dressing took the crowd through a change. The first reaction was still anger. The word neglect landed on several tongues, but the shape of suspicion shifted. A farmer who had shouted before blinked and reached for his hat. "He coughed often," he said. "I heard it 2 nights ago." Elise's jaw tightened. The parson proposed the old communal washing ritual as both test and protection. "Bring a tub and warm water," he said. "Let the midwife wash and show the wound. Let neighbors see care was given or not." Mary moved to the well, calling women who would help. The crowd split into hands that fetched buckets and hands that folded arms. Enya did not move to help at first. She watched a puddle form at her slipper as a bucket tipped. Mary spoke to Enya then, close and quiet. "If you are tired, I will do what must be done. We will show them the dressing and the handkerchief. We will tell the truth that we can show with our hands." Enya nodded once. Her lips did not make a sound. She felt suspicion like a bruise beneath her ribs. It made her breathe unevenly and forced her to explain with action. She lifted the corner of the shroud and allowed the midwife to inspect the dressing full on the village green. When the midwife unfolded the shroud under the church leaning lamp, she held steady and said what she saw. "These marks are consistent with fever, with weeks of coughing. The skin is cooled, not marked by blows. This bandage was sewn badly to hold a compress. He was ill and poorly tended. There is no sign of a direct blow that broke bones or split the skull." Elise's hands balled into fists. She stepped forward and yelled, "You lie! You lie for her!" The parson placed a hand on Elise's shoulder. Elise shoved the parson's hand away and shouted, "She let him freeze!" She let him sleep on straw, and he cuffed and cuffed. She killed him by not taking him in. "Mary Ann, Anya, you were with him." She used the name twice to steady the exchange. The parson asked the crowd to stay calm, and the midwife told 2 young boys to fetch more water and a coarse cloth. The square buzzed with a new edge, anger shifting toward blame of poverty and fear. The search of the cottage had also turned up a folded scrap of paper tucked in a slipper. A small note with a shorthand of the man's coughs, written by his own trembling hand. A neighbor read it aloud. "Coughing since Monday. No coin for herbs." That morning the crowd heard a sound like a shutter closing. People moved their weight and looked at one another in ways that admitted shared failure. A woman whispering in the back said, "We all knew he was sick and no one brought the broth." The mood softened in parts, but it did not resolve the accusation. Elise paced and ground her heel into the dirt. At noon, as the sun warmed the stone, the midwife asked for those who had known the man to tell what they had done. A baker stepped forward. "I gave him bread 2 times this week," he said. A cobbler admitted he had not charged the man last month, and had left a pair of sandals by the door. Mary named these small acts and listed them out loud, each a concrete thing that had been done or not done. The crowd listened in fragments and then in open phrases. Another external fact arrived. A neighbor mentioned seeing the man feed the chickens less often these past days. The midwife noted these facts in a small book. Elise's voice broke in. "That does not change what she did. She could have gone to the parson. She could have begged," she said. Her tone moved from blame to a kind of raw fear. The community's anger, which had been a heat, now cooled into something like shame for not knowing the real state of his illness sooner. People began to step back and look at Enya as if searching for a visible sign of guilt. Mary for order and motion to begin the washing ritual. A tub was set by the well and cold water was drawn, then warmed with straw fires until steam lifted in a way the midwife approved. Women formed a line and took tools. Coarse linen, soap, herbs. The midwife said, "This is the test. We wash and show what was done on the body. We will not let rumor decide." The ritual had the shape of ceremony and the aim of proof. It would change the square into a place of witness rather than accusation. As the midwife and Mary worked near the tub, the midwife spoke quietly to Enya while lifting the shroud. "Tell me how you tended him. Tell me if you wrapped clothes, if you dampened the brow, if you fed him broth." Enya answered in short phrases. "I sat. I warmed water. I boiled nettles twice. I wrapped the compress and tied it over his chest. I sat with him most of the nights." Each phrase acted like an evidence point. The midwife hummed once and pointed to the dressing seam that had been poorly stitched. The crowd watched the midwife peel back the makeshift bandage and reveal the reddened skin beneath, marked by fever and recent attempts at poultice. A farmer who had been murmuring leaned forward and said, "He had this for days." That discovery shifted the narrative in the square. The idea of sudden violence lost ground. Yet the accusation still roared in Elise's throat. The energy changed again. Suspicion now moved toward collective neglect and fear of illness rather than a clear act of murder. Then Elise did something the square had not expected. She stepped forward, hands trembling, and struck her palm against her forehead. She voice breaking in a way that cut through other sound. "I tried to wake him. I shook him because I thought he was sleeping. I grabbed his shoulders, I called his name, and when nothing came I told you she did it." The square turned silent in 3 beats. People who had spoken seconds before fell quiet. The parson's shoulders slackened. Mary pressed her fingers to her mouth. Elise's eyes filled and she spoke faster, words spilling out that made new things apparent. "I found him as I ran by the cottage at dawn, Elise. I saw him still and I panicked. He had coughed before. I gripped him hard, I hit him in my fear. I did not mean to. I thought my shaking might bring breath back." Her sentences were ragged. That confession acted like a pivot. Suspicion shifted into shame. The crowd's posture changed. A man who had been about to shout lowered his chin. A child blinked hard and turned away. The midwife lifted a hand and said, "We must not trade one harm for another. The truth is this, he was ill." Some shook him in panic. "The dressing shows fever and poor care, not a blow that split bone. We will let the parson decide the town's response." The parson looked at Elise, then at Enya, and then out to the neighbors who stood with tools and buckets and torn sleeves. "This is not the time for punishment. It is the time for answering needs. We will not send her to the stocks. We will set a plan for burial that the village will help pay for, and we will watch Enya's house for a month. Those who can bring bread will bring bread. Those who can sit and fetch water will do so. Elise will take what she has done and help in the week ahead." His voice was plain and short. It carried authority that turned argument into a decision. Elise sagged and put both hands to her face. "I will," she began and stopped, then said, "I will fetch herbs. I will stand watch. I will not shout again." Her words were a shift from accusation to an attempted repair. Mary nodded as if to finalize. Enya felt a lightness that was not relief so much as the easing of pressure on a wound. She touched the handkerchief once and handed it to Mary for safekeeping. That evening, beneath the church, leaning lamp, neighbors gathered for a small private rite by lamplight. The parson led a short blessing. A few women braided a simple wreath from dry wheat and rosemary. The midwife tied the shroud more securely and tucked a bit of lavender into the folds. Mary and a baker carried a small loaf to lay beside the body. Enya sat by the hearth and watched the motions. She did not speak for long stretches. When she did, it was to name a small task she had done or would do. Arrange the blanket, sweep the corner, boil water for the next watch. Conversation in the room was direct and concrete. "We will cover the cost of a modest grave. the parson said, and people called out numbers or offered to fetch a cart. I will bring a blanket, someone said. I will help with the fire, another offered. Elise came in at the end and placed a small pot of warming broth by the hearth. She did not look at Enya at first. Then she set the pot down and said, I did not mean to make this worse. I thought he had been harmed. She paused, hands folded tight. I was afraid of the fever. I acted badly. Enya looked at her, then at Mary, and took a single, careful breath. The narrator stood by the doorway and noted each small, audible exchange, the way people committed to tasks aloud as if naming them made them real. The narrator's voice recorded simple facts rather than moral judgments. Who spoke, who brought bread, who fixed the shroud. The last act of the night was ordinary and precise. A neighbor, Jonas the carpenter, set a small clay token on Enya's kitchen table before he left for the grave. He said, It will not pay all, but it will buy a marker. He looked directly at Enya as he spoke the last word and then turned and left. Enya picked up the clay token with 2 fingers and felt the faint thumbprint of Jonas where he had pressed the wet clay. She placed it in the center of the table and wrapped her hands around the cup of broth that Elise had set down. Her limbs shook a little, not with fear now, but with exhaustion. Mary pushed a folded strip of linen into her palm. Rest for an hour. Mary, then we will work on the list of things. The parson will be at the church at 9. We bury him tomorrow. The words were simple and unadorned. They mapped out the next day in actions. Outside, someone hammered a stake in the lane to mark the grave's corner. A cart creaked past, bound for the edge of town. The parson closed the church door with a sound like a small, final click. Enya drew the blanket tighter across her knees and looked at the small token on the table. She remembered the night before when she had kept his head cupped and the exact way his breath had thinned. She recalled Elise shouting and the moment of accusation. She also felt the midwife's steady hands and Jonas' thumbprint on the clay. The day's change, suspicion into confession into collective care, left a bruise and a relief that could be measured in actions. Late that night, when the lamplight threw a narrow pool across the floorboards, Enya rose and put the clay token back in its place at the center of the table. She folded the shroud once more and smoothed the bandage sedge. She set a small bowl of water for the morning beside the door and pinned a list to the wall with Mary's handwriting. Bread, Jonas. Firewood, Baker. Watch, Elise. Cart, Miller. Each item was a promise turned into a concrete thing. She held the list and felt that the crowd's decision had been made into tasks she could touch. At dawn the next morning, someone knocked at her door. The parson's voice asked to lead the burial. Enya opened the door, wiped her hands on her apron, and said, Lead it at 9. The parson nodded and stepped in to see if there was anything else they needed. In the cottage, the clay token sat on the table, small and rough, and when the parson glanced at it he folded his hands and said nothing. The chapter of accusation had closed into a set of chores and a grave plan, and the village had turned from shouting to steady work. The final beat arrived as a single, clear action. The parson took the list from the wall and read aloud the names who would bring the shroud and the bread, and Elise, standing by the doorway, began to braid a strip of linen for the grave. Her fingers were steady this time. The day's end would not erase what had happened. There remained the ledger of who had spoken and who had withheld, and the memory of Elise's hands on the man's shoulders in panic. But that the community had chosen to turn anger into care, a burial paid by neighbors, a month of watching over Enya, and concrete tasks named and accepted. The last line of this chapter is not a sentiment but a motion. The parson lifts the small clay token, tucks it into the parcel for the grave, and closes the lid, setting it in the cart that will carry the man away at 9 in the morning. Elise shoved the blanket aside at the river bank and shouted, She killed him, so loudly that the lantern flames jumped. Suspicion arrived in the circle with her voice. People turned and stared, hands still on poles, feet leaving wet prints in the grass. Mary stepped forward, fingers curled around a lantern handle, and held up the light as if it could keep talk from becoming a verdict. The village had come to the water with a body on a blanket, and no agreement about what to do next. The immediate problem was one of blame, not of burial. That question, who did this, and whether it was a crime, sat in the first lines of the night's work. Mary's suspicion of a quick punishment kept her voice low. She remembered the bedside 2 nights before. The man had stopped breathing under Ennia's hands while Elise had accused Ennia near the cottage. That memory guided Mary now. She would not let a shouted charge decide a man's end. She stepped between Elise and the blanket, set the lantern down, and said, "We keep calm." "We hear what happened." Her tone did not plead, it directed. Mary had been at the bedside, had smelled the starch on Ennia's apron, had set the small cup to the man's lips. Those concrete actions stiffened her resolve here. Ennia stayed by the edge of the blanket, hands tucked into her apron, chin damp from river spray or tears. She did not move when Elise called her name. "Ennia, say something," Elise demanded. Elise's voice had the raw edge of someone who had dragged a shrouded body into the square once before. The word murder had left her mouth then and landed like a stone. Tonight she used it the same way. Ennia replied in a single breath, "I found him gone. I tried to make him warm." The short line carried no flourish. It was a report of what she had done and what she had seen. A fisherman with wet boots stood slightly apart, his net thrown over his shoulder. He was the first to break the tightening pause. "I walked the bank at dusk," he said. "I saw footprints away from the boat, toward the widow's cottage." The villagers shifted. Elise's jaw tightened. Ennia's hand found the apron string and pulled. The fact footprints moved suspicion along a new track. People began to form quiet questions aloud. Whose footsteps? Elder Thomas came forward with his cane tapping the earth. He had a voice that slowed arguments, not because he spoke softly but because people listened. He did not let the moment become a rout. "We set a council," he said. "Constable, you stand with me. We hear witnesses first." Constable Rowan moved from the outer ring and planted himself between the lanterns and the blanket. He looked at the shrouded body, then at the faces. He did not yet touch the cloth. The act of naming procedure kept talk from immediate punishment. It made the night into something that could be measured. They formed a circle of lanterns and low voices. Mary recounted the bedside details again, this time in short sentences. He grew cold. Ennia set his pillow. I pulled his hand. Elise struck the lamp. Each sentence dropped a small fact into the center. The village listened not for feeling but for action. That was the town's language, what hands had done. The circle's attention tightened on pieces of work and on who had been where. A reed snagged on the blanket rimaled a scrap of cloth. Mary stooped, picked it up, and held it between finger and thumb. The fabric was coarse, a different weave from Ennia's apron. This is not hers." Her voice contained a shift. Suspicion bent toward doubt. From the accusation that Ennia had killed a man, Mary's discovery sent the crowd into a less certain place. Elise struck the earth with her heel. "Then whose?" she demanded. Voices rose and fell in short bursts. "Maybe the fisherman moved him." Someone offered. The fisherman answered. "I passed before the body was found. I did not touch it, Ennia. I found him sitting on the bank. He was cold when I lifted him." That report carried a different weight now that the scrap did not match her cloth. The village began to trade small, concrete counterclaims, times, places, pairs of hands. Each claim produced a small change in the emotional field. Suspicion loosened into puzzlement. Puzzlement tightened into anger for some, relief for others. Outside the circle, a child cried once and stopped. The lanterns made small, orangey pools on grass and motioned faces into relief. Mary kept the cloth in her palm and said, "We take the scrap to the widow's door in the morning. We ask who owns this weave. That choice, find an outside owner rather than punish on the spot. was Mary's attempt to shift the village toward deliberate action. The village split quietly into factions, those who wanted swift public justice, and those who wanted careful reckoning. By a slow vote of gestures and small words, Elder Thomas called for witnesses. The fisherman stepped forward again, boots leaving wet marks on the bank. I saw a track leading toward the widow's cottage. He repeated, "It turned here," then walked up the path. He tapped the ground with his toe to show the line. Then it went back to the river. The pattern altered the village's assumption. Someone had come to the water and left. People exchanged looks. Elise's quick certainty became a narrower, angrier point. Then who walked away? She snapped. Enya answered, voice short and even. I carried water that evening. I passed the bank after dusk. The man was already there. Her sentence was both denial and detail. Elise cut across. You were there alone with him. You had his hands in yours. Conversation turned to concrete motion. Who had carried what? Who had been alone? Each motion anchored belief. Mary pushed back. We must not bind ourselves to one picture yet, she said. We gather facts. We do not decide a person's life on a shouted name. Her action was practical. She ordered 2 men to fetch a board and lift the blanket for the constable to inspect. That motion forced an external event. The body was uncovered, and the constable checked for bruises, broken skin, or signs that a hand had been used to end a life. The inspection was brisk and not theatrical. Constable Rowan checked the neck and jaw, fingers careful, eyes focused. Rowan spoke in short sentences, no clear wound on the neck. He has bruising on the temple, no obvious cut. He paused. We examine his stomach. Did he take anything late? Questions like these turned accusation into inquiry. Elise jabbed a finger. He was sick. He coughed all week. He had no coin for the doctor. She brought in a reason for mercy and a reason for blame in one line. The crowd absorbed both and shifted uneasily. At this point, an event altered the balance. A wet, coated man ran up the lane and came to the lantern circle. He held a thin, dirty bundle, an oilcloth pouch, and thrust it toward Elder Thomas. I found this by the reeds, he said, breath short. He took off gloves with shaking hands and opened the pouch to show a small, carved wooden token tied to a string. This belongs to the widow's partner, he said. I've seen it before. People leaned in. The token was specific. A carved fish with a gouge on its tail. It matched a mark the widow used to make on her partner's pipe. Elise's eyes turned hard. So he had that token when he died, she asked. Mary observed the shift and felt the next emotion. Doubt resolving into concern for the widow's agency. Did you see anyone else near the reeds? The man shook his head, no. But the footprints led toward the lane where the widow lives. The pieces fit differently now. Suspicion folded into the possibility of mercy. The village pushed forward with questions. Thomas suggested a private hearing near the lantern ring so the widow could speak without the entire crowd jabbing at her. The widow approached with a slow gait. She did not clutch any token or cry out. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady in a way that made silence feel loud. I stayed by his bed as he coughed and could not sleep, she said. He gasped and could not find peace. He did not want to drown in pain. I pressed the water to his lips. I held him when his breath failed. She did not use the word mercy at first. The actions. Steady hands, cups of water, clothes to the forehead. Her account created a new center of gravity. Elise did not accept that center. You did this to him, she said. You took his last breath. Her line was 2 accusations in one. The village felt the pulse quicken. Enya's fingers curled around the hem of her apron. She looked down and then spoke. Mary saw me try to warm him. I sang the suing song to keep my hand steady. Her line gave a small domestic image that contradicted the idea of a violent act. People imagined the song and the motion of suing. It made the widow's claim about easing suffering more plausible. The fisherman added a detail. I saw footprints that looked heavier than Enya's, he said. They were broader, set deeper. That observation introduced a twist. The tracks did not match the small slipper of the widow's home nor the narrow sole of Nes' shoe. It suggested someone else had been there, and that the guilt might be on a different person's shoulders entirely. That twist required the village to reconsider an earlier certainty. Elise' loud charge. Tension rose toward a climax when Elise demanded immediate punishment. "We cannot let mercy become murder," she said, voice high with hurt and anger. Mary stepped between Elise and the widow. "We decide with facts." Mary insisted, "We do not punish on pain alone." Their exchange accelerated. Elise cutting and fast, Mary measured and firm. Thomas called for order and then asked the widow directly, "Did you end his life?" The widow looked at him, then at Mary, then at Enya, and finally drew in a breath. "He begged me to stop," she said. "For 2 nights," he said. "Do not leave me like this." I held his hands. I pressed water to his lips. The breath left him with my palms on his chest. The sentence carried both confession and reasoning. There was no flourish, only the sequence of acts. Elise pounded the ground with her heel. "You admit it, then," she said. "You did not let him continue to suffer. You decided for him." The argument's rapid exchange followed. Elise single-line attacks, Mary's short counter commands, Thomas calm directives. The sound of voices was a tangible thing in the lantern light. Then Constable Rowan interrupted with a practical demand. "We must decide what law says and what mercy allows. The council will weigh both." He spoke the civic constraint aloud, and it landed like a tool in the middle of a heated kitchen. The villagers argued about law in 3 quick bursts: for punishment, for leniency, for a private burial. Each side made small, concrete offerings: a fine, a watchful night, a procession without public spectacle. The debate produced a minor standoff, a mini cliffhanger for the group's future. The climax formed when the widow folded her hands and told the exact reason for her choice. She named the man's cough, the nights without sleep, the way his hands shook when he tried to stand. "He me to end it so he would not slow. Drown in pain," she said. "I took a pillow from the chair and held his head. I pressed until he left with my name on his lips." She paused. A few neighbors inhaled sharply. "I did it because I could not watch him die slowly," she went on. That admission struck at the village's split. Was compassion a crime? Eliz answered with quick, hard lines. "You killed him!" "He had no right to ask you. What of the law?" Those short sentences pushed the village into a tight knot. Mary then offered a different set of actions. "We carry him to the chapel, plain and small. We do not shout punishment. We mark this as a mercy death and bind ourselves to give the widow a task of repair." Mary suggested practical penance: repairing shutters, chopping wood for a season, mending nets. Her proposals turned abstract guilt into a sequence of duties and labor. People responded to tasks better than to phrases. The idea of effort diffused some anger. Elder Thomas weighed both sides out loud. He the widow if she would accept a public penance that made her take responsibility without shaming her into exile. "I will do what is needed," she said. Her answer was not theatrical remorse. It was an offer of work. The village murmured and then, by a series of small votes and hushed agreements, chose the modest farewell Mary suggested. A somber procession, no spectacle, and a period of community service by the widow and those who supported her choice. Dawn found the village carrying a small stretcher wrapped in linen. Lanterns were replaced by tired lantern, bearers, and the first grey light. They walked a slow route through lanes, past the widow's cottage, and toward the riverside procession. Enya, Elise, Mary, Thomas, Rowan, and a handful of neighbors moved with quiet steps. Their roles were clear in the morning. Some carried, some adjusted the linen, some sheltered the widow with a shawl. The action itself, lifting, walking, setting down, was the village's language for closure. At the widow's cottage the next morning, a few neighbors gathered around the hearth. They cut a small wreath from thrifted materials: strips of cloth, a ring of twine, a few dried flowers. Mary handed the needle and asked someone to stitch slowly. The motion of sewing turned grief into work. Enya boiled water, and set a gourd of porridge on the table. The practical tasks of feeding, stitching, and sweeping did not erase what had happened, but they changed its shape from accusation to shared responsibility. The narrator watched these motions and noted how ritual made choice visible. He described how hands moved, how eyes lifted, how a small task could answer a large accusation. The final shifts of emotion, suspicion to doubt to compassion, anger to acceptance, were visible in bodies. Elise's jaw softened when she tied the wreath. Aeneas' shoulders relaxed when Mary spoke her name and asked for a steady stitch. A neighbor named Joran, once vocal for punishment, took up the broom and swept the threshold. His action announced a private conversion. By mid-morning, the procession had been marked in small acts. A covered face, a sung line at the river, the placing of the wreath beside a modest pile of earth, then the filling in with quiet hands. The widow kept her gaze on the water. She placed her palm on her partner's token to steady it, and then let it rest on the wet linen. When they returned to the cottage, people did not cheer or chastise. They carried out practical things. They mended a net, they boiled broth, they split wood for winter. Those were the concrete measures that replaced immediate anger with future labor. A few surprises remained. The scrap of cloth Mary's hand had found was traced back, that afternoon, to a young tailor who had mended a coat near the common path. He admitted to losing a scrap while fetching thread. The fisherman's testimony about footprints was rechecked and found to match a heavy, underfoot shoe owned by Joran, who had been near the reeds that night fixing a net. Joran's explanation, he had walked the lane to fetch a lost knot, was offered in short sentences and accepted as adequate after he agreed to repair the widow's fence. These twists changed the narrative. The town had initially focused on Enya because she was visible at the bedside, but the concrete facts redistributed responsibility to those whose actions had been small and practical, not malicious. In the last moments before they closed the cottage door for a slow night, the village performed a final small ritual. Mary held the wreath in her hands and passed it carefully to the widow for him, she said. The widow placed it on an empty chair by the hearth where he used to sit and where his pipe had rested on a hook. She smoothed the cloth and sat down to stitch a small patch on an apron, a work that refused grand pronouncements and instead bound living people into ordinary tasks. Enya boiled a fresh pot of tea and set a cup at the chair's foot. Someone patted her shoulder. The narrator finished the account not with a wide moral but a concrete beat. The widow rose, took the cup to the sink, and closed the cottage door with a steady hand. The decision to treat the death as mercy had not erased conflict. It had instead negotiated a set of duties and small reparations that the village could carry forward. They had weighed suspicion, found new facts, and chosen actions that kept the community functioning. The last image is specific and physical. A wreath on an empty chair, a patched apron on a lap. A closed door that marks the end of that night's reckoning and the start of the next day's work.